Burkina Faso rejected the CFA franc. Mali expelled French troops. Niger shut down Western bases. And Guinea rewrote its constitution. 4 nations. One message. We are not for sale. And our sovereignty is not negotiable. For too long, Africa was told what freedom looks like. Told which elections count. Which leaders are legitimate. Told to rise only when the West says it's time. But a new wave is here, one that doesn't ask. It decides. Guinea isn't standing alone in defiance. It is standing in rhythm with a continent that is waking up. From Conakry to Bamako. From Niamey to Ouagadougou, the drums of dignity are beating. And if that scares the old order, good. Because Africa is not a chessboard. And Guinea is not a pawn. On September 24, 2025, Guinea crossed a line the world had drawn. A constitutional referendum, proposed by a military government, passed with 89% support. Buried inside that vote was a trigger. The old rule banning junta leaders from future elections. Gone. Just days later, Mamady Doumbouya's name appeared on the official list of presidential candidates. The election is scheduled for December 28. No longer a soldier in transition. Now, a contender for permanence. The headlines say, Guinea returns to democracy. But what kind of democracy begins by rewriting its terms? That's the question they don't want us to ask. And that's exactly where we begin. When ECOWAS spoke, most nations listened. It wasn't a choice, it was conditioning. Decades of post-independence diplomacy taught West African states that survival meant conformity. When a military takes power, ECOWAS is quick to condemn. It demands a transition. It sets timelines. And if those timelines aren't met, sanctions follow like thunder after lightning. Guinea was supposed to obey that sequence. When Colonel Mamady Doumbouya took power in 2021, ECOWAS gave him 6 months to hand it back. No exceptions. No negotiations. But he didn't. Not because he wanted to cling to power. But because Guinea had seen enough rushed transitions to know the game was rigged. In a region where coups are condemned but corrupted democracies are ignored, Guinea dared to break the rhythm. ECOWAS called it defiance. But to many Guineans, it was the first honest decision made by someone who wasn't pretending to be a savior in a suit. There was something different in how Doumbouya responded. He didn't roar. He didn't grandstand. He simply refused. Not with weapons, but with silence, and steady reforms that didn't ask for applause. Guinea froze cooperation with ECOWAS institutions. Refused the 6-month deadline. Refused the externally imposed calendar. And yet, Guinea didn't collapse. No economic freefall. No nationwide revolt. The streets remained quiet. Not because of fear, but because, for the first time in years, people weren't afraid of the man at the top. In the eyes of ECOWAS, this was heresy. How dare a military officer speak of sovereignty while delaying elections? But in Guinea's eyes, the greater heresy was allowing elections to be held just to please foreign timelines, while the same foreign powers had done nothing when Alpha Condé bent the constitution to extend his reign. The hypocrisy was suffocating. ECOWAS had turned a blind eye when Condé changed the constitution in 2020 and jailed protesters. But now, when the people who rose against that tyranny sought time to rebuild, they were branded as rebels against democracy. What kind of democracy only matters after the palace is stormed, but never when the people are screaming from below? In his speeches, Doumbouya never mocked ECOWAS. He just questioned its purpose. We are not against integration, he said, but Guinea will never accept imposed democracy. Sovereignty is not a delivery we wait for. It's a decision we make. That statement didn't make headlines in Paris or Brussels. But it lit a fuse in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey. Because what Guinea did wasn't just about Guinea. It was a signal flare. The soft rebellion didn't happen with soldiers storming borders. It happened in words like, transition on our own terms. It happened in the silence that followed ECOWAS ultimatums. It happened every time Doumbouya refused to attend summits that treated Guinea like a misbehaving child. And here lies the truth no one wants to say aloud: ECOWAS isn't just a regional bloc. It has become an instrument to preserve the post-colonial order. A gatekeeper of a political architecture that rewards those who play by the rules, even when the rules betray the people. Doumbouya understood this. He studied it. He called it out, not with hostility, but with restraint. And that's what made it powerful. He didn't send shockwaves. He shifted tectonic plates. Because in this version of Guinea, there were no violent mass purges. No foreign embassies burned. No press conferences shouting death to the West. Just a quiet refusal to be governed by panic and pressure. But that doesn't mean there wasn't pressure. It was constant. Sanctions. Frozen funds. Isolation from regional meetings. Guinea was painted as the rogue actor in a fragile theater. And yet, something strange happened. The more ECOWAS threatened, the calmer Guinea became. Because while ECOWAS built deadlines, Guinea built institutions. While they sent inspectors, Guinea sent auditors. While they demanded elections, Guinea demanded constitutional clarity. It wasn't chaos. It was patience. The kind of patience that scares systems built on urgency and dependence. And it worked. Slowly. Painfully. But undeniably. In 2025, when Guinea put its new constitution to a vote, 89% approved. Not because every citizen understood every clause, but because for once, they were invited to shape it. Not just sign it. And that distinction matters. This was no foreign-funded draft rushed through Parliament. It was debated. Delayed. Disputed. And in the end, decided, not by ECOWAS, but by the people of Guinea. That is why Doumbouya didn't blink when critics cried foul. Because for once, the power didn't come from above, it rose from below. It wasn't perfect. No revolution is. But it was theirs. And if you're still watching this and wondering, how far should a nation go to protect its right to decide? Then perhaps you're beginning to understand the real reason why Guinea said no. Not to democracy. But to borrowed definitions of it. So if this moment makes sense to you, if something in you resonates with a people taking their time to do it right, then don't just scroll past. Leave your thoughts below. Let others know you're listening. Because Guinea may stand alone in press conferences, but across this continent, more are waking up. And no one silences a continent forever. There is a strange quiet in the halls of ECOWAS when a president rewrites the rules to stay in power. No sanctions. No ultimatums. No dramatic press statements demanding accountability. When Alpha Condé amended Guinea's constitution in 2020 so he could run for a third term, the streets erupted. Protesters were beaten. Activists disappeared. But ECOWAS did not call it an illegal seizure of power. They called it an internal matter. They told Guinea to preserve stability. They shook Condé's hand in public, even as his people bled in private. It wasn't just hypocrisy. It was a doctrine. A doctrine that says power is legitimate as long as it looks orderly, even if it comes from oppression. When Doumbouya overthrew that system, he didn't just remove a president. He exposed a framework. And that made him dangerous. Because suddenly, people across the region began asking, why are elections only sacred when they protect the status quo? Why is ECOWAS louder after a coup than after a massacre? Why does democracy need so many lobbyists? These aren't questions ECOWAS wants to answer. Because ECOWAS is not designed to be revolutionary. It's designed to be reassuring. Reassuring to investors. To embassies. To old regimes and their foreign patrons. So when Guinea refused to play along, the pushback wasn't just political, it was existential. How do you control a region where states start writing their own scripts? It wasn't just Guinea, of course. The shockwave had already started. Mali had cut ties with French troops. Burkina Faso was turning military bases into sovereignty schools. Niger closed its doors to foreign interference. And Guinea? Guinea dared to say, "We will not be told who we are." In boardrooms across West Africa, that sentence sounded like treason. But in the streets of Conakry, it sounded like truth. Because people remember what ECOWAS didn't do. They remember how the bloc stayed silent when their internet was cut. When their sons were jailed, when ballots were burned in daylight. They remember that ECOWAS only became urgent when the puppet strings were severed. The truth is brutal. These regional institutions were never built to empower the people. They were built to preserve the illusion of sovereignty, so long as it remained convenient to foreign interests. That's why Doumbouya's calm rejection was so powerful. He didn't tear up the ECOWAS charter. He just treated it like an opinion, not an order. He turned the page, and started drafting his own. This wasn't defiance for defiance's sake. It was a recalibration of purpose. For too long, West African nations have been told they are free, while being fined for stepping outside the lines. What Guinea did was simple. It refused to apologize for choosing a slower, sovereign process over a fast, foreign-scripted one. And by doing so, it exposed the contradiction that ECOWAS tries to bury under communiques and meetings. Because here's the real question. If sovereignty is conditional, is it sovereignty at all? Guinea chose to answer with action, not debate. They didn't ask for permission to consult their people. They didn't wait for approval to write a new constitution. They simply did it. And when the numbers came back, when 89% said yes to a new path, what did ECOWAS do? They questioned the process. They raised doubts about transparency. But they said nothing when Condé bulldozed through dissent with police batons and foreign PR firms. So who exactly decides what is legitimate? The people? Or the partners in high places? Guinea is not perfect. It still wrestles with its past, its power structures, its fears. But what makes this chapter different is that, for once, it is not being ghostwritten by someone else. And that terrifies the gatekeepers. Because if Guinea succeeds, it sets a precedent. Not just for post-coup transitions, but for post-imperial politics. For the idea that a nation can rise, not by mimicking Paris or Washington, but by listening to its own heartbeat. And that kind of sovereignty doesn't need approval. It just needs courage. Courage to say, we will not be managed. We will not be rushed. We will not trade our future for applause. In the long run, Guinea's refusal to kneel may matter more than any summit it skipped. Because it redefines legitimacy not as what others accept, but as what the people live with. And in that definition, Guinea is not alone. It is simply ahead. The vote was cast. The papers were counted. And the world, expecting chaos, found something else, participation. It didn't fit the usual narrative. There were no armored vehicles rolling through capital streets. No flames licking the gates of Parliament. Just long lines. Quiet determination. And a people choosing, for better or worse, to own their future. When Guinea passed its new constitution with 89% approval, critics dismissed it as orchestrated. Too neat. Too quick. Too aligned with one man's ambition. But that dismissal revealed more about their assumptions than it did about Guinea. Because for decades, Guinea's political life was dictated by the needs of others, foreign investors, geopolitical brokers, and legacy elites. Constitutions were amended, ignored, or weaponized to ensure continuity for the same circle of rulers, always cloaked in the language of democracy. This time, it was different. Not because it was perfect, but because it was imperfectly Guinean. The new charter included changes that made headlines abroad. A 7-year presidential term, renewable once. A newly established Senate, with 1/3 of its members appointed by the president. To outsiders, it sounded like consolidation. To many inside, it felt like structure. Because when institutions are fragile, chaos doesn't come from too much order. It comes from having none. For years, Guinea's institutions were little more than paper. The rules existed, but power was wielded through networks, backdoors, and foreign embassies. So yes, the new constitution grants the president influence. But it also grants the nation a starting point. A skeleton to which it can attach flesh, with time, with struggle, with practice. And in a country that has known coups, dictatorships, and manipulated elections, that alone is a kind of progress. Critics abroad worry about one man ruling for 14 years. But they never raised their voices when Condé jailed activists for protesting his 3rd term. They never warned of authoritarian drift when Western consultants helped sanitize his campaigns. Their silence then makes their outrage now feel selective. That's why many Guineans ignored the noise and focused on the vote. Not because they worshipped Doumbouya, but because, in a region where democracy is often sold but rarely delivered, he offered something else. A blueprint, not a finish line. Guinea didn't just vote for a president's future. It voted for its own terms of engagement, with itself. And that decision, slow, uncertain, vulnerable, is more honest than many of the democratic transitions praised by the international community. Because democracy isn't just procedure. It's permission. And Guinea is finally giving itself permission to experiment, to fail, to rebuild. That is what frightens the status quo. Not the number of years in office, but the number of people now invested in shaping what comes next. It's easy to call this consolidation of power. Harder to admit that power, for the first time, is being mapped by those who live with its consequences. So when Doumbouya registered as a candidate for the December 2025 elections, it didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like the next logical step in a process no longer dictated from abroad. Yes, he once said he wouldn't run. But promises made in the ashes of collapse don't always survive the flames of rebuilding. And perhaps that's not a weakness, but a reality. The kind that forces nations to balance ideals with the demands of transition. He will now face other candidates, some allowed, some barred, all scrutinized. And the vote will be imperfect. But it will be theirs. And that matters more than any imported ideal of perfection. If you're still watching, still listening, ask yourself this. Should nations be punished for writing systems that reflect their fears and hopes? Or should they be supported in trying something different, even if it doesn't resemble what's expected? Because if democracy means anything, it must allow room for difference. And if sovereignty is real, it must include the right to choose a slower, messier, self-made path. That is why Guinea's constitution matters. Not for what it guarantees, but for what it makes possible. It makes possible the belief that law can grow from struggle. That order doesn't have to mean submission. That elections don't have to be circuses run by foreign observers and financed by outside interests. It opens space for debate, for resistance, for reform. And it grounds that space in something written by the hands of the governed, not gifted by the hands of the powerful. The West may call it flawed. But for many Guineans, it is the first time the law has felt like it belonged to them. And that shift, from law as instrument of power to law as product of participation, is not a detail. It's a revolution. So whether or not Doumbouya wins, whether or not this system lasts, one thing is certain. Guinea has stepped off the imported path. And once that step is taken, there is no going back. They said this was the end of democracy. But they said nothing when Alpha Condé rewrote the constitution to stay in power. They called it reform. They called it legal. They called it necessary. When the streets filled with protesters, when people were dragged from their homes for demanding fairness, the world turned away. There were no sanctions. No speeches. No emergency summits. But now, as a new charter rises, debated, ratified, and voted on, they call it dangerous. Not because of what it contains, but because of who it empowers. This is the twist no one wants to admit. Power rewritten from above is constitutional. Power rewritten from below is illegitimate. They fear this version of Guinea not because it is failing, but because it is functioning without their permission. In 2020, Condé's changes were backed by consultants, protected by troops, and blessed by silence. In 2025, Doumbouya's changes are backed by ballots, debated in open forums, and challenged in public view. One was tolerated because it maintained the familiar. The other is condemned because it dares to build something new. So ask yourself. What is more democratic, obedience to a model written elsewhere? Or the courage to create one at home? They say Doumbouya is consolidating power. Maybe he is. But Condé concentrated it too, then weaponized it. And no one said a word. That silence wasn't neutral. It was strategic. Because stability, in their eyes, is not when people are free. It's when they are manageable. Guinea is not manageable anymore. And that's what scares them. Because once a nation tastes authorship of its story, its laws, its future, it becomes very hard to control. Not by troops. Not by aid packages. Not by think tanks. What's happening in Guinea is not a perfect democracy. But it is a real attempt to define one from scratch. And that is more dangerous to the old order than any military coup. Because this time, it's not soldiers taking power by force. It's civilians reclaiming it through design. Through debate. Through defiance. And that, more than anything, is why the world calls it a crisis. Not because Guinea is lost. But because it is found, on its own terms. This is not just a chapter for Guinea. It is a signal to every nation that has been told to wait its turn, to follow someone else's timeline, to imitate someone else's path. Guinea chose differently. It stumbled. It recalculated. It rewrote. But it did not retreat. And that, in itself, is a revolution. Because sovereignty is not loud. It is quiet, patient, persistent. It is the decision to speak in your own voice, even when no one wants to hear it. So if this story touched you, if you believe that no nation should have to apologize for choosing its own future, then let it echo further. Like this video. Share your thoughts. Subscribe for more stories of Africa rising on its terms. Because this isn't the end. It's the beginning of something bolder. And now it's our turn, to keep the fire burning.